Today I'm attempting my most ambitious project yet. A chair. It's finally summer in the city, and this project dragged me out of the depths of winter and into more optimistic times. I'm using these boards for the stretchers of the chair. I'm first marking out and cutting a shape into one of the boards. After my last video, I've been asked a lot about how I source my wood. In this case, I found these oak boards at the perfect size on eBay. I currently don't have the means to plane my own timber, so I always buy my pieces planed all round. I then use the first board as a template for the second. I rough cut the second board with a jigsaw and refine the shape on my belt sander. Next I have to cut out the middle part of each stretcher so that I was left with 2 tenons on each stretcher piece. I did this by making several shallow cuts with my miter saw. I then cleaned up this cut with my new router plane, giving a really clean finish. I then gave the pieces a round over on all sides. This left me with a lot of tear out and burn marks, so I could tell there would be a lot of sanding in store for me. I used a standardized length of 65mm for the tenon detail, which would be consistent throughout the piece. I then gave the inner ends of the tenons a round over using a chisel and then refining with a file. The 2 stretcher pieces are joined using a half lap, and I needed this to be done at a 95-degree angle, so I cut out a paper template and tried to steady my sawing hand. All of my designs are carefully modelled on the computer, so I have a lot of faith in the dimensions that come from the 3D model, and that they align to the size standards for furniture design. It was then that I realised I made the classic mistake of giving the round over to the pieces before making the half lap. This meant that when gluing them together, I'd be left with gaps on either side of the filleted pieces. To fix this, I simply cut out the wrongly filleted portion and glued in a plug, trying to match the grain orientation as best as I could. I then glued up the whole stretcher assembly and checked again my angle was correct. I later trimmed and filed down the plug so the joint looked far better. Next I could move on to the legs, first cutting them to size and adding a round over to both ends. I made a method for cutting mortises into the legs by setting the drill press so that the head just barely cut through to the other side. I then used a small hole as a reference to finish the cut from the other side. This removed any chance of tear out. Once cut, I used the jigsaw to elongate the holes. For the rear legs, I repeated the same method but used some spacers to ensure the holes were cut at a 5-degree angle. This would be important later. With all the holes enlarged, I used this new tool, a Shinto rasp, to refine the edges further. A lot of people ask me where my workshop is based. I actually live on the north side of London, and my workshop is all the way across the city in the south, which is about an hour's commute. If you're enjoying the channel and want to see me continue to make this journey in the name of producing more furniture, please consider subscribing. It allows me to continue doing what I love. Thank you. Back in the workshop, I am now making my own plywood for the seat pan. I decided to do this because I needed to attempt bent lamination for the seat back, so I wanted to keep a consistency between the pan and the back. Once dry, I marked out my seat outline and cut with a jigsaw. This revealed some gaps in my layers, so I tried to fill these with glue and left them to dry. I then centered the stretcher assembly and marked out the cuts for the mortises on the seat. I gave this a round over and sanded the edges. I could then attempt the tricky task of cutting out the mortises in the seat. I just had to be extremely careful and keep cross-checking with the stretcher to ensure I got a tight fit. The idea here is for the seat pan to act as a brace for the stretcher assembly so that it has a functional and a structural purpose. Beyond all my expectations, it actually fit together almost perfectly. Once glued up, I trimmed off the excess and sanded the tenons flush. It was then I realized that because of the nature of plywood, when I tried flush sanding the joint, it revealed the ply layers inconsistently. So with this in mind, I took the radical decision to sand back the top layers of ply to give a better joint overall. In doing so, this revealed some really interesting grain and knots in the layers of birch. Let me know what you think about them. Personally, I think they look great. I then gave a slight round over to the exposed part of the tenon with the Shinto rasp. Next was the part I had been dreading, trying my hand at bent lamination for the seat back. I did a test using ratchet straps with some pieces of 3mm birch, and to my amazement they actually began to bend. So I added glue and strapped them back up. I also used all my clamps just for good measure. Once dry, I cut out the seat back shape with a jigsaw. I then refined the curve with a belt sander. I could then start to dry fit everything and mark out the spacing for each part relative to each other. I even broke out the laser level for guidance. With all the curvatures of the piece, it was hard to line things up accurately. I then trimmed down the excess from the stretchers because this offcut would be used for the tenons for the back. This ensured a visual consistency between all joinery elements. This was also a tricky bit of joinery as I had to cut out the holes in the back to align with the legs, which were at a compound angle. Again, I took my time and cut these as carefully as I could. The really tricky part though was to cut the mortises into the legs to receive the tenons. I first sanded the leg at an angle to give me a flat reference surface. And then I marked the center line. Using the drill press, I made several holes to remove as much material as I could. I then used a chisel to clean up the mortise. It actually amazed me how much more confident I had become with the chisel and with hand tools in general. I managed to get far better control than with my previous projects. I then sanded the tenon flush into the seat back and cut it down to size. I could then begin the very stressful glue up. I took my time with this, and because I had dry fit everything together so many times, it actually all came together very smoothly. Once dried, I could trim off all the excess tenons. I first tried to shape the tenon with a chisel, and that went about as well as expected. So instead I used my block plane, which went far better. Unfortunately, despite all my best efforts, there were still some gaps in the joints. I guess some of the angles were ever so slightly off, and the error built up over the piece as a whole. As much as it pains me to say, I did have to use some wood filler on some of these joints. With a lot of sanding all over, I could then apply finish. The finish really made the oak come to life, and although I didn't quite nail the joints as I hoped, the whole piece really came together as a unified design. And with that, the piece was done. So why would I say that a seemingly nondescript chair is my most ambitious project yet? Well, a chair to me is the combination of good design and good engineering. After all, it needs to support the weight of a whole person while looking good and being comfortable. At the same time, this piece allowed me to be expressive with the language of joinery, and where possible I tried to use the same system for a variety of different uses so that there could be a kind of efficiency between function and structure. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.